Alright, hey everyone, welcome to the Chapter 2, Section 2 video. This one's going to cover most of the key terminology and key concepts from Chapter 2, Section 2 in your textbook. Before I start off, this chapter has a lot more graphs than you've probably seen before, than you probably saw in my last video. That's because this chapter is one of those chapters that's really best explained through pictures and images rather than through the key terminology. When I was going through the book, I really didn't like a lot of what I saw, and even an American student with a really strong access of English would have a really hard time with this chapter, so don't feel bad if you're confused, guys. So let me go ahead and start off. That's enough of the little preamble. Okay, the first thing I want to talk about, guys, is the energy in an ecosystem. If you remember from the first chapter, energy is really important to organisms. Energy is how we move. Energy is how we get bigger. Energy is one of those things that's fundamental to life. Animals have two ways of getting energy. The first one we call an autotroph. An autotroph is basically an organism that makes its own food. There are really only two examples of this. Plants do this, and most of the plant-like organisms, so some bacteria, algae do this. Anything that has chloroplasts and can do photosynthesis is able to make their own food. There is even one animal that does this as well, but they don't actually make their own food in the same sense. They just steal the cells that allow you to make your own food. But there's only one animal that's even remotely capable of doing this. Some animals, like the hydrogen sulfide bacteria, are also able to make their own food as well, but they're on a totally different system. If you actually want to Google this whole hydrogen sulfide bacteria stuff, it's pretty cool. It's actually this whole thing that happens at the bottom of the ocean. It's definitely worth checking out. But yeah, in general, the first way is you make your own food. Plants do this, some bacteria do it, and it's straightforward. Now, the second term is called a heterotroph. A heterotroph is an organism that has to consume other organisms to survive, basically. So, a good example of this are animals and funguses. Because animals, as you already know, eat things like rice, eat things like other animals, cows, insects, things like that. That's one way of getting energy. You can also consume an organism when it's dead. That's what funguses do. Most funguses, with a few exceptions, usually consume dead animals in a way that animals usually don't do it. And that's their way of doing it. So the best way to look at this, guys, is that autotroph, you make your own food. A heterotroph, you eat other organisms to survive. Okay, now heterotrophs are a little more complicated in their categories and how we call heterotrophs and how we describe them. They come in different varieties. The first one we call an herbivore. You've probably heard this term before. An herbivore means you eat plants. Herbivores, like I said, you eat plants. A good example would be a deer. Another example would be some mice are herbivores. Some other a lot of insects. Insects are usually herbivores. Ask anybody who's a farmer. He goes, farmers hate insects because they like to eat their crops. The second type of heterotroph you're going to look at is something we call a carnivore. A carnivore is basically a meat eater. They eat meat in order to survive. Example, lions. Lions are a great example of this. They don't ever eat any plants. All they usually do is eat meat. Now, there's a third category that we call omnivore. Omnivore does both. Omnivore is like a human being. A human being eats both plants and meat. So we fit into this category right here. And I already put down the best example of an omnivore is a human, but a lot of other animals and insects meet this category as well. Mice are a really good example. Mice eat a lot of the same things humans do. They're capable of eating fruits and nuts and things like that, and they are just as willing to eat the food out of your pantry as well. So those are the three basic types of heterotrophs that the book talks about, and they're all really interesting, I think. Okay, now food chains. Food chain is an interesting concept to talk about. What this is basically it is a who eats who in the animal kingdom. This picture isn't the best one I could find, but it wasn't the best one out there, but unfortunately it was probably the only one that wouldn't get in trouble for using it. So, here's how a food chain works. There's a producer. Producer is a heterotroph. This is something that makes its own energy. So a good example of that is like a plant. They make their own energy from sun and water. Now, the next level up is an herbivore. Herbivores are always the next level up in food chains because they're the organisms that are going to eat plants. Sometimes, obviously, you're going to have a couple omnivores in here too, because omnivores also eat plants, but in general, your next level up in the food chain is some kind of a herbivore. Now, you bounce one level up from that, and you were in omnivore and carnivore territory. These are the animal eaters. These are the meat eaters. These guys typically eat just the guys that eat the plants. So carnivores, oftentimes called secondary consumers. Don't worry about these words right here, guys. This is more for a college course. We might cover this later on in the book, but for now, just ignore these terminologies because they're not really useful for you guys right now. And almost always, when you look at a food chain, there's almost always something at the very top of that food chain. Something that eats pretty much anything it gets its hands on. This is basically the top predator. A good example would be like a human being. Human beings are almost top predators for many organisms because very few organisms eat human beings, at least intentionally, unless you're a shark. So that's really the best way to look at this, is that you have the autotroph, make your own food, and you have the herbivores, they eat plants, and some omnivores here. The secondary consumer eats only the herbivores and the omnivores, and then there's usually a carnivore here at the top that eats kind of everything below it except for the grass. Now, even this guy here cannot escape being eaten at some point in time. The top predator here, being the hawk, will eventually be decomposed by fungus. Fungus are kind of the cleaning ladies of the animal world, in which they eat dead tissue. It's their job to turn it back into essentially carbon dioxide and water, and eventually the nutrients that they break it down to, and the funguses, go back to the grass. And that brings us to our next concept. This is called a food web. The food web is going to look a lot like your food chain right here, but there are some pretty big differences. A food web, and we're going to make one of these in class. A food web looks at who eats who in the animal kingdom. So here's a way we look at it. Obviously, you have the plants here at the bottom. The plants are being eaten by these guys right here. So you have rabbits, squirrels, mice, seed-eating birds, and a lot of herbaceous insects. Herbaceous being they eat plants. So you have this whole group here, all eats the plants. Now things get a little more interesting. Obviously the foxes are going to be eating the rabbits, the squirrels, the mice, and the bird-eating birds, if they can get a hold of it. It'd be pretty hard for a fox to do, to be honest. He goes, but the hawk and owls also eat a lot of these things too. But one thing they didn't do a good job of showing on this graph is that oftentimes the fox would be willing to eat the owl and the hawk babies, and the owls and hawks, if they could get a hold of a fox, if they think they can grab it, they definitely will. So these guys will eat each other as well. These herbaceous insects, the ones that eat plants, are eaten by spiders and other predatory insects. Now, spiders and predatory insects will also eat each other, which is why there's arrows pointing to them. This bird, because the bird species oftentimes eat the spiders, the birds are eaten by snakes. The snakes typically eat everything in this area right here. Basically, all a food web is really saying is a food web is just saying who eats who. And that's all it really is. These things are used in ecology to oftentimes kind of trace where energy is going. They're pretty cool. I've seen them used in research, and I really wish we could do some of it, but unfortunately, it's just not really, there's not a lot we can do with it in Riyadh because there's not a lot I've been able to see that helps me create a food web for you guys. So look at this and kind of understand this is how a food web works. Okay, this is the last concept for this chapter that is going to be a little bit of a challenge for you guys. This is called an energy pyramid. An energy pyramid basically talks about where energy is going in an environment, in an ecosystem. Here at the bottom of the pyramid, you have like autotrophs, you have plants and bacteria, things like that. These are the ones that are turning sunlight into energy, basically. One step above that, you have herbivores. Herbivores are the plant eaters, like I've said before. But why we call this a pyramid is if you look at the pyramid, there are more autotrophs than there are herbivores. That's because energy is lost as you go up. If you've learned this in chemistry and physics sec, you'll learn that changing energy around, you always lose some of it. So what happens here is when the herbivores eat the autotrophs, they're not 100% effective at changing the energy from plant matter into basically animal matter, into skin, into bone, into tissue. So they lose some of that. So you have this group here. Then you have the omnivores and the carnivores. Now the omnivores are going to eat from the autotroph level here too, but the carnivores are going to eat exclusively from here and here. And they're losing more energy. As you can see, there's a smaller pyramid here. And these ranges right here basically represent like populations. They represent how many animals do this kind of behavior. At the very top you have carnivores who only eat these two levels right here. There are not a lot of carnivores. There are not very many of them. That's because as you go up, carnivores are getting less and less energy every single time you move up a step in the pyramid. We'll cover more about this later, hopefully, because this is a really awesome topic, and it's very interesting once you begin to see how it works. And I'm hoping that we can do some interesting stuff about this, but we'll see. Now, your book uses a concept called trophic level, and your book introduces this idea towards the very beginning of the chapter. I think it's a really stupid idea, because trophic levels are hard to explain without explaining the previous two ideas, food web and food chain, first. The trophic level is basically this whole level right here. There is the autotroph trophic level. There's the herbivore trophic level. There's the omnivore carnivore trophic level. There's a carnivore trophic level. And what a trophic level really is saying is it's saying how much energy is at this level. And one thing in biology you'll learn is that there's more energy at the bottom trophic level than there is at the top trophic level, because some energy is being lost as things are changing. So when this plant matter is being turned into skin and bone and blood and all those kind of things, some of the energy is being lost. So this trophic level has less energy. When these omnivores and carnivores eat the herbivores, again, some energy is being lost. So there's less omnivores and carnivores than there are herbivores. The same thing holds true here at the carnivore trophic level, in which that there's less carnivores than there are of everything else here, because they're losing energy as you move up the chart. The last concept that your book talks about is something we call biomass. Biomass is one of those things that it gives us a way to estimate how many organisms are in an area. If you know from chemistry, you know that mass is like how many grams that something is. So it's like 20 grams, 30 grams. It's almost kind of a measurement of weight, but it's close to that. That's what biomass is. Biomass is basically saying how much mass, how many organisms are at certain levels. So let me explain it like this. Because there's more autotrophs in the world, they weigh more, basically, because there's a whole bunch of autotrophs, ergo they're going to weigh more. As a result, there's more biomass at this particular level. Herbivores, as you move up the herbivore, since there are less herbivores, there's less biomass at this level. Their omnivores and carnivores suffer from the same problem, is that there are less biomass of these guys, there's less of them than there are down here. So all biomass, guys, is really saying how much mass, how much stuff is at each level. And you're probably wondering, well, Mr. Russell, how can you possibly know all that? how can you possibly know how much biomass is at every single level? In reality, you can't. You never really know how much biomass is at each level. But some ecologists do estimation. They can estimate how much autotroph biomass there is. They can estimate how much herbivore biomass there is. So one of the areas of ecology they work on is that they try to figure out how much biomass is at each level. And if you ever decide to go further into biology and you want to explore this idea more, you'll actually learn that you can actually trace where energy is going directly from animal to animal to animal based upon its biomass. And it's actually really cool how they can do it. So yeah, here's a little plug for a biology profession. If you're interested in ecology and seeing how the world works, one thing you can do is you can see how much biomass is being moved around throughout the environment. And yeah, that's basically it, guys. That's all the major concepts from this chapter. I hope you found this, at least for Mark, somewhat interesting, and this should be a good way for you to take notes and get ready for the exam. Talk to you guys later.